So first of all, I just wanted to talk about the nature of this session. I've entitled it kind of Build Back Better and really framed it around a lot of the current conversation around what this means for the UK economy and for society, for the nature of work in a post-COVID world. And I think it's just really, worth emphasising that this has affected the whole world to greater or lesser degrees. I think we're certainly in the top 3 in terms of worst affected countries right now. And the impacts of COVID, we know, are going to be globally felt. So we are very much looking at a kind of a global depression. And I think the statistics really bear that out. So you can see the extent on this slide of some of the immediate shocks. But the graph on the bottom left, which is very US specific, I think tells an even more concerning story than purely the drop in GDP and economic activity. And that's the intermediate impact on jobs. And I think we all recognise that there are jobs that will not come back post-COVID. And particularly in the US, they're potentially looking at an unemployment rate of around 32%. Which is significantly higher, a third higher than what was experienced in the last Great Depression of the 1930s. The impacts are, almost doubled by the extent of public sector borrowing that's being acquired right now. So we're going to have huge structural debts around the world and huge demands on public service and potentially very significant numbers of unemployed people. It's a stark next few months, and I think those people that initially suggested that there would be a very sharp recovery are now rethinking, because we're already beginning to see that human behaviours are not returning necessarily back in the way that we may have anticipated, and that economic activity is going to return much more slowly than we initially thought. This slide's from the New Scientist. It's an old slide, but I really like it because I think it just captures the extent of change compressed into a very, very tight time span. So the New Scientist here just took random statistics like population or GDP or the number of motor vehicles, for example, and just mapped what's happening across a whole random set of social, cultural and technological advancements. And you can see that really in the last 70 years, everything has changed, and it's changing at an accelerating rate. This slide is around is from the World Economic Forum. Every year they map a risk register, and I always like looking at it because it gives an insight into the world's leading minds, some would argue, in terms of what are the threats. So on the left column, going vertically, you've got kind of the extent of impact, and then on the bottom axis, you've got likelihood. And what we see really is even last year, across a multitude of risks assessed by the World Economic Forum's economists, spread of infectious diseases, which I've circled, was there, but it certainly wasn't there necessarily as a priority for the world to consider amongst the myriad of other concerns that we are faced with. So particularly around climate change and extreme weather events, but also cyber attacks, consumable water crises, biodiversity loss, critical information infrastructure breakdown. All of these fears and concerns and risks were present and were viewed by the WEF to be even more likely than a spread of infectious disease, as we've seen. And I think that's really what I just want to really address. We do need to think about business and society in our economy in a post-COVID world, but it's not as if the other threats that existed just 3 months ago are still not absolutely breathing down our necks. So we know about climate change. We know that the number of natural weather catastrophes and natural catastrophes more broadly are constantly increasing. We have to battle with an increasing lack of soil fertility in huge swathes of the world, where we are dependent on food for an ever-growing global population. We're damaging our freshwater supplies, and so we are seeing greater areas across the world in crisis in terms of consumable usable water. And of course, there are other issues like plastics, and I won't go into all of them, but we're also in a period of huge kind of economic instability, as has been borne out by both the financial crisis and COVID. So much was done in the post-war years to try and stabilize global economics, and so much has been done in the last 30 years to kind of undo that regulatory framework, which has led to much greater fluctuations in economic activity and a much more stable global economy as a consequence. So if you think that the last global economic crisis that struck 10, 12 years ago was the last one you'll see, I suspect you may be mistaken. And then inequality, this ongoing battle that we have, whereby wealth is increasingly concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. The Oxfam poster, 8 white men own more wealth than half the world's global population. What we see is this is a trend right across the world. The first graph only up to 2010, the second graph up to 2015. What we are consistently seeing is, yes, we're taking people out of poverty at the very bottom of the pyramid, but that pyramid is becoming elongated. More and more wealth is being concentrated at the very peak, and it's actually the middle that's being stretched and starved. And that has huge consequences for us all. This is about power. This is about wealth. And I think you just have to look across the United States at the moment to see the amount of anger on the streets isn't just because of the unwarranted murder of a black citizen at the hands of the US police. It's much more than that. And of course, in a UK context, we still have huge challenges in our own economy, pre and post-COVID. 1 in 4 children in the UK live below the poverty line. Is poverty likely to increase in the next few years? I think almost certainly. I think inequality and poverty are likely to, despite the government's commitment to level up the country. I think a post-COVID world makes that much more difficult and much more expensive. And we see households in the UK and in other parts of the world kind of increasing steadily their own indebtedness. So furthering that kind of inequality, that level of income insecurity. I've already referenced that, I'll move on. And of course, all of these things contribute to the sort of mental health pandemic that we are also experiencing. I reflect and consider how many lives are lost each year to mental ill health, and the very nature of the society that we've created and how it contributes to that, the cost and the burden on society, the cost and burden on families and loved ones who deal with the adverse consequences of poor mental health across our society. And so we see, people rising up in all sorts of different ways, people frustrated, and even, moderate commentators, even chief economists at the Bank of England, recognising that things have to change. We have to address these inadequacies within our economic systems and structures. I like this slide. I hope you enjoy it. In a world of ever scarcer resource, we really have to find better ways to adapt and cope. And I think what we're seeing, and what we've seen certainly in the last 20 or 30 years, is an increase in the use of trade as a weapon. We're beginning to see, populist leaders emerge, and the relative peace that we've enjoyed over the last 4 or 5 decades, is certainly now looking more fragile than ever. And that's partly as a consequence of food scarcity and water scarcity and a growing global population and, huge challenges around kind of economic development, migration, all of these things contributing. However, ladies and gentlemen, there is hope. I am here to spread a little bit of hope and joy. Social enterprises, the sector that I so passionately believe in, that I've worked in for many years, and that I now am chief exec of, Social Enterprise UK, are emerging quite rapidly. There are now 100,000. They're not all small micro businesses, although many are. Some are very large. Our top 5 members at Social Enterprise UK have a collective turnover of somewhere in the region of around £20 billion, representing about 5% of jobs, strongly emerging. but perhaps not as visible and often conflated with voluntary organisations rather than at the forefront of business responsibility. You'll know some of these pictures, but just to put it in context, the Eden Project, GLL providing gyms and leisure facilities, the largest leisure provider in the UK. Lots of community energy schemes emerging to localise our energy system and supply, empower people through community shares in the ownership of their energy supply, raising local capital to finance the investment that's required, and then tackling fuel poverty by using the profits to address local issues and, of course, reducing carbon. Many great organisations out there working to address all of the sustainable development goals to really do business in a way that provides, yes, profit that can be reinvested back into social good, but profitable businesses that are absolutely, it's in their DNA and in their rules and constitutions to put people, community, planet first. And so many of these organisations, bus companies, as you've just seen, I think the interesting stats in terms of the government's agenda around levelling up, around creating secure work, creating better representation of minority groups in the workplace and in leadership positions. Well, many of those answers exist within the social enterprise business model. They're much more likely to be in areas of high deprivation, much more likely to be led by women or people of an ethnic background. Much more likely to be starting up right now, and that's partly because they do resonate with the times. It's not just me that says we need radical reform. I'm all for businesses greening their products and ramping up their CSR, but there has to come a question, given the urgency and the scale of the challenge, is it enough to just ask businesses to do a bit more social responsibility? And I think we have to address the structures and systems. This isn't just going to be resolved by the will of executive teams. Our whole economy is geared towards profit first. And if we're going to address the social and environment problems we face, we need to gear the efforts and power of business towards principally solving those urgent challenges, rather than always prioritising the needs of their investors and shareholders. So I think we agree, there are big challenges. All sorts of people are coming around to this way of thinking, business leaders, academics. It's not just me. The structure of business does matter. That's one of my points. We need these new structures. These structures are emerging, but markets are not evolving rapidly enough to help these businesses genuinely scale. Those organisations, those businesses that put people first, that put community first, that put the environment first, are not always advantaged in the marketplace. Price still remains dominant in many markets, and doing the right thing just isn't encouraged or rewarded in the significant way in which it could. We have to address some of the structures and systems. This isn't just about consumer demand or encouraging businesses to be more social. We have to address the real structures and systems that drive the global inequity, that drive the ongoing system that destroys our natural environment, and that can be done. We have to look at tax, we have to look at regulation, and we have to look at legislation. Yes, we can celebrate social entrepreneurs emerging, but actually we can't just celebrate the good. We have to take much stronger action against those that are having a net negative impact on both our social structures, whether that's through work insecurity, low pay, or through the depletion of our natural resources. But I'm going to come to an end and open this up for questions, because I'm looking at my own screen here and I can't see if there's any activity in chat or anything like that. Things are moving, markets are changing. We're seeing a new generation of academics and thinkers move into this space of shared value. I think we have to go beyond just augmenting and structuring businesses differently. This does get to the heart of capitalism and how we regulate and shape markets. And local authorities, universities, hospitals, consumers all have a part to play in that. Absolutely. But we need to move faster, and we need to be radical. We do need to be radical in our thinking. We need to remember and reflect on the size and the scale of the challenge, not just globally, but also within our own communities. And if we want to see different outcomes, we do have to do things differently. There are some great businesses out there that put people and planet ahead of profit, but also make profit and can provide return to investors. This has to be the new normal. This has to be the way that business is done. We see that these models are viable, they're competitive. This piece of research demonstrated that in most cases, social enterprises are even more cost competitive than their mainstream commercial competitors. This is a quote. I'm going to come out here and see if there's a conversation going on. I hope you've enjoyed what I've got to say. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. But yeah, Einstein was right. We can't solve the problems by using the same kind of thinking, I would say, or indeed business structures we used when we created them.